Good afternoon, and welcome to the discussion on the origin of novel and also the literary context of the 18th century England. Now, in the books on history of literature, we come across this particular age as the age of prose and reason. But if we talk about the age in philosophical terms, it would be more appropriate to call this age as the age of enlightenment. Now, why enlightenment? Now, if we look at the philosophical and the social context of 18th century England, or rather 18th century Europe, we find a revival of the what we call rationality. That is, the principles of empirical logic, scientific temperament, and also the desire to look at things and to analyze things in terms of argument. So that is the spirit of 18th century if we look at it in this way. Now, first of all, that this question that if we ask that what is the reason behind the emergence of this particular age as the age of reason. Now, if we look at the very economic and the social context, we find that the age renders, it demonstrates a transition from feudalism to capitalism. That is, the change, shift in the mode of production. Now, till 16th century, the production is dominated by the feudal mode. That is, the prioritization of land over labor. And this mode of production, which is primarily agriculture, was a labor intensive production. So agriculture was the primary mode of production till the 18th century. Now, after following this discovery of the new colonies, for example, the North America by Columbus and India by Vasco da Gama, and the explorations and voyages in Asia, Africa, North and Latin Americas, we find that this new mercantile class or this new merchant class, they have acquired a lot of money by exporting materials from Europe to the other continents and to buy the raw materials from the different continents to sell them in European market. So as a result, we find that this merchant class have acquired a lot of money in their own hands. And in 18th century, late 17th and early 18th century, that has witnessed one of the most remarkable events in history, that is the Industrial Revolution. This single phenomenon of Industrial Revolution has actually changed the whole social, economic and cultural paradigms of Europe. Because we find that on the one hand, there were a series of technological discoveries like steam engine by James Watt, the railways, the rail engine by Stephenson, and also several other scientific and technological experiments and invention. And most importantly, the scientific theories of Sir Isaac Newton, which changed the whole structure or this whole domain of human thought, and changed the human, not only changed, reshaped the human perception about universe and human perceptions about the existence on earth. So that is how we find that the scientific temperaments are creeping in, and the perceptions of the common human being, mostly the educated, middle class, urban population, they were going through a process of transformation. And there was a sort of development in the development and renewed interest in logic, argument, reason. And people, the newly educated middle class, they refuse to accept anything without evidence, without definite proof, and without definite logic. So that was the principle which was embraced by the 18th century middle class urban population. Now, if we look at this very literary output of 18th century, so before analyzing those texts, we need to look at the very context in which all these literary and artistic creations took place. Now, philosophically, the most influential philosopher of 18th century, rather 17th, 18th century, it was René Descartes. Now, Descartes has made a very famous statement. And the statement is, cogito ergo sum, which means, I think, therefore I am. So I think, therefore I am. When this statement is being made, it differentiates between a human and the other animals. So why is a man a man? Why is an individual? Because he can think. So this ability to think, ability to judge, ability to perceive, that is the characteristic which differentiates a human from an animal. And when Descartes talks about thinking, I think therefore I am, means I think therefore I exist. So what is the pattern of thought that he was implying to? What is the type of thought that he was implying or trying to point out? Thought means random thoughts, haphazard, bizarre, weird, unrealistic thoughts? Perhaps not. Because when he says, I think therefore I am, or I think therefore I exist, he implies the logical thinking. Thinking in terms of logic, in terms of reason. So this empiricist philosopher, empiricists or these empirical philosophers, they tried to make a difference between the patterns of thought. Now if we make a table, we can differentiate, in order to differentiate different thought patterns. On the one side, there would be rational thought. Rational means whatever could have been perceived by our five senses and could have been explained in terms of logic. That is rational. And what cannot be perceived by the senses, cannot be explained, cannot be illustrated by patterns of rational or logical thought, they fall into the category of irrationality. So rational, irrational. That is the difference, that is the distinction which was made by these 18th century philosophers. And what they prioritize, what they tried to express, tried to stress upon, that influenced the paradigm of 18th century thought. And we find that this reason, these principles of reason and rationality became so apparent that in 18th century, when Isaac Newton says that the world of God is not perfect, no one came forward to burn him at stake, to burn him alive at stake. Because in 16th century, when this Copernicus, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, they talked about the solar system, then Copernicus had to flee. Galileo was imprisoned, and Giordano Bruno was burnt alive at stake as a heretic on the street, because questioning, interrogating the divine principles, questioning the principles of the Catholic Church, that was a crime. That was not sanctioned by the society, that was not acceptable. But in 17th, 18th centuries, when these new philosophers, when these new scientists began to question the divine principles, began to question the dictates of the Catholic Church, they didn't have to face any punishment. Instead, Newton was made the Fellow of the Royal Society of England. So that was the change which was taking place. And that was the change which also had an impact upon literature, upon art, upon culture. Now, when we look at the literary output of 18th century England, the most prominent and the youngest of them is novel. The novel as literary form, it originated in 18th century Europe, 18th century England. Now this question that why did novel of all these literary forms emerge as the most prominent and the popular literary form in the 18th century? So first of all, in order to understand that, we need to look at the very structure and the principles of novel as literary form. First of all, if we look at the very thematic content about the first novels which were written in the 18th century, for example, novels by Richardson, Pamela, Clarissa Harlowe, or novels by Fielding, Tom Jones, or novels by Daniel Defoe, Moll Flanders, Robinson Crusoe, Roxana. Now, who are the protagonists? Who are the central characters? Are they kings, queens, princes? Or they were mythical characters, like the legends, like characters from Iliad, Odyssey, those myths, mythical characters, gods and goddesses? No, none of them. Neither gods, goddesses, nor the aristocrats appeared in 18th century novels as characters. Instead, we have, for the first time, we have the middle class, the characters who belong to the middle class, the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois. Now this bourgeois class who began to take control over the production system, no wonder that they would emerge as the protagonists of this new form. So in its treatment of the characters and the themes, novel has made a shift from the traditional subjects, from the traditional characters, in terms of class. Instead of aristocrats, we have people belonging to the middle class and the lower middle class. And this shift in the subject anticipates, if not suggests, the shift in power, the shifting of the power from one class to another. Because in 1740, Richardson published his Pamela, and 1789 we will have to witness, we witnessed the French Revolution. So what would happen in future was actually anticipated in the novel form. That is, the power was shifting. This shift of power was shown in the novel. Secondly, novel as a literary form emerged as one of the finished products to be published and sold in the market. There were books of poetry. Poetry was mostly for the literary exercise, a fashionable practice of the aristocrats. The plays were mostly written primarily for performance, but the novels were solely written and published for entertaining the newly educated, the newly leisured class, that is the middle class, and primarily women, who had to stay at home, and in order to spend their leisure hour, they preferred to read novels as a mode of entertainment. And also, writing novels became a profession for the 18th century British novelists. For example, Aphra Behn, perhaps the most popular novelist of the 18th century, and she earned her livelihood by writing novels. So this is, as far as the theme is concerned, the novel represents the emergence of a new class, that is the middle class as well as bourgeois. Novel anticipates the shifting of social, political and economic power from the aristocrats to the middle class or to the bourgeois capitalists. And thirdly, the novel represents the emergence of a new industry, that is the publishing industry, with the potential customers. Who are the potential customers? The newly educated reading public and the newly literate women of urban England, because novels were written mostly to cater the tastes and preferences of the urban middle class audience. So essentially a sophisticated, fashionable, urban literary form. Now, as far as the structure is concerned, so that is all about the thematics. Now the structure is concerned. Now what we find that this novel, what it tries to do, the novel represents episodes, sequence of events And also, novels, they represent the change, transformation in character and change of events. Now, this very structure, if we consider that format in as far as the form is concerned, in terms of the form or the format, how novel is different. First of all, the first important point that strikes us, that the novel is a dialogue. Drama or the play, that also is a dialogue. That also represents dialogues. But the novel is more expanded, extended. It actually expands the scope of communication, because the novel, by virtue of its huge form and larger canvas, it actually provides scope to multiple characters to speak, multiple voices, multiple points of view, multiple opinions. That is what Mikhail Bakhtin calls, when he talks about novel as literary form, he calls this phenomenon as heteroglossia, multiple voices, the existence of multiple voices in a literary text. That is what would have been possible to be represented in novel as a literary form. Now, this final question, that why was novel absent, or why didn't those novelists, they write novels before 18th century? Why Elizabethan age is dominated by drama or medieval age is dominated by poetry? Now, if you look at medieval age, we find that medieval age, it was theocentric. The single God, the Christian God, and every thought, every idea, every imagination was centered in God. So there was almost a monopoly of God, monopoly of Catholic Church in the medieval Europe. So that monopoly could best be represented in poetry, which is essentially a monologue, where only a single voice is allowed. And secondly, poetry represents autocracy. A single voice, single opinion of the poet, which dominates the whole scene. So that was the phenomenon we come across in medieval age. So autocratic, monopolistic thought, structure. So this monologic form. Elizabethan age, rise of skepticism, Renaissance, rise of skepticism, doubts, the beginning of questioning. People started to question, conflict between the autocratic king and the feudal lords, conflict represented in drama. Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, Edward II, everywhere. In every Elizabethan tragedy, we come across this conflict between an individual autocratic king who wants to hold the absolute power and the feudal lords who are resisting that attempt of absolute monarchy to grasp and hold the power. That's why drama. In 18th century, we find there was the early signs of democracy. Democracy as a political, as a social system that was actually emerging. People, they began to talk about opinions, participation. So, democracy is a political system which is pluralistic, where you have to accommodate every single opinion. Conflicting, divert, contradictory opinions have to be accommodated in that system. So democracy is a political form, is a political system where you need to hold multiple opinions. So that needs to be represented only in a literary form which could accommodate multiple voices. Hence, the origin and development of novel as the most popular and pertinent literary genre, as a literary type. For example, in the very communication model of Aristotle, we find that there were three elements of communication: sender, message, receiver. The sender sent a message to the receiver. Communication ends. Because during Aristotle, there was the political system that was monarchy, where only decisions were conveyed by the king. The king made the decision, he intimated, he informed the citizens about the decision, and citizens had no other option but to abide all these instructions. So it's a one-way communication. You cannot ask the king that why did you take this decision? No, you cannot. But in a democratic system, you could question your government. You could question, you could oppose, you can criticize your government. So in the communication system, in the modern communication system, there is another element: sender, message, receiver. Another element is added, that is feedback. Because in democracy, you can give your feedback. Your feedback is asked by the government. Your feedback is needed to run the administration smoothly. So that's why this feedback. Similarly, in order to hold multiple divergent contradictory opinions, which are the governing principle of a democratic system, novel appears to be the most pertinent literary form. Hence, the origin of novel that took place only in 18th century, not before, not after. Thank you so much.